I want you to imagine planes landing every few minutes, each one paying a landing fee just to touch down on your runway. Nobody can build a competing airport next door. There's no such thing as a scrappy startup undercutting you on price 2 blocks over. You've got a monopoly on a piece of infrastructure that an entire region depends on. It sounds like the ultimate boring business, an asset nobody can compete away from you, generating fees on autopilot. But guys, here's the gut punch for you, and it comes early on this one. If you're picturing a major commercial airport, you almost certainly can't own one. In the United States and in most of the world, the airports handling scheduled passenger traffic, the ones with the Starbucks and the TSA lines, are owned by cities, counties, port authorities, or other government entities. They're not for sale, and they're not typically moneymakers in the simple landing fee sense the fantasy implies. What you can actually own is something much smaller and much stranger: a small general aviation airport, or more commonly, the actual private business that operates inside a publicly owned airport, something called a fixed base operator, or FBO. Those are completely different businesses from the fantasy, with completely different economics, and understanding that distinction is the whole point of this video. Let me actually break it down for you. First thing first, the taxonomy, because this one has more layers of ownership complexity than almost anything else we've covered on this channel. At the top, there's the major commercial hub, the large airports handling scheduled airline traffic, which are overwhelmingly publicly owned in the U.S., operated by a city, county, or a dedicated airport authority, and often run at an operating loss on the airfield side, subsidized by non-aeronautical revenue like parking, retail, and rental car concessions. These are not something a private individual buys. Below that sits the small regional or general aviation airport, smaller fields serving private pilots, flight training, corporate aircraft, and light charter operations rather than scheduled airline service. Some of these are publicly owned by a small municipality, but a meaningful number are privately owned, particularly smaller fields that started as a farmer's grass strip or a single owner's private airstrip that gradually opened to public use. This is the closest thing to owning an airport that's realistically achievable for a private individual or investor group. Then there's the fixed base operator, the FBO, which is the actual private business layer that exists at the vast majority of airports, public or private. The airport authority owns the runway, the taxiways, and the land. The FBO leases a portion of that land and operates the actual commercial services, fuel sales, hangar and tie-down rental, aircraft maintenance, flight training, and ground handling for arriving aircraft. This is where almost all of the real, ownable economic activity at an airport actually happens, and it's a fundamentally different business than owning the airport infrastructure itself. And finally, there's the private airstrip, a landing strip built on private land, sometimes attached to a ranch or a residential flying community, not open to public use and not really a business in the commercial sense at all, more a private amenity than a revenue-generating asset. For this breakdown, we're focusing primarily on the FBO model at a small to mid-sized general aviation airport, because it's the version of owning an airport that most closely matches what someone dreaming about this business is actually able to buy into, and it's where the real economics are. Worth dwelling on for a moment, why doesn't a random investor just buy a small municipal airport outright, the way you might buy a storage facility or a gym building? Part of the answer is that many small municipal airports simply aren't for sale. They're treated by their local government as public infrastructure, similar to a road or a water system, and selling one off entirely is politically difficult even when it's not commercially profitable to operate. The other part of the answer is federal grant history. A meaningful share of small airports in the U.S. have accepted funding at some point from federal airport improvement programs, and that funding typically comes attached to long-term grant assurances, legal obligations to keep the airport operating as a public-use airport for a period that can stretch for decades. An airport carrying those obligations can't simply be sold to a private buyer who wants to shut it down and redevelop the land, which removes a huge portion of what would otherwise be the most valuable use of that land in a growing area. This is part of why the FBO model, rather than outright airport ownership, is where almost all of the realistic private economic opportunity in this industry actually sits. Entry costs. If you're buying an existing small general aviation airport outright, the rare case where the land, runway, and all related infrastructure are privately owned and for sale, the price varies enormously by size, location, and existing infrastructure, but even a modest private field with a paved runway, basic hangars, and fuel infrastructure can run anywhere from $1 million to several $1 million, and that's before any of the deferred maintenance a runway and its supporting infrastructure inevitably gets addressed. Building a new runway from scratch is an entirely different order of expense, and one most private buyers never actually take on. Runway construction, grading, drainage, and paving to meet the load-bearing and length requirements for even light aircraft can run into the millions of dollars per runway depending on length and surface type, before lighting, navigation aids, or any terminal-adjacent buildings are added. This is part of why almost nobody builds a new airport from raw land. It's dramatically cheaper to acquire or lease into an existing one. Far more common, and far more realistic, is buying or starting an FBO business at an existing airport. Here, the entry costs look more like a specialized commercial real estate and equipment business. Leasing land from the airport authority is typically done through a long-term ground lease, often 20 to 50 years, rather than a purchase, since the airport authority generally retains ownership of the underlying land even when private operators run the businesses on top of it. This ground lease structure is worth understanding on its own terms. You're not buying real estate in the way you would with the storage facility or gym businesses covered earlier on this channel. You're buying a long-term right to operate on land you'll never own outright, which means your entire business, including any buildings you construct, ultimately reverts to the airport authority when the lease ends, unless the lease specifically provides for renewal or compensation for improvements. Hangar construction, if you're building rather than leasing existing structures, runs roughly $25 to $60 per square foot depending on size and whether it's a simple metal structure or a more elaborate corporate hangar facility, and a functional FBO facility with several hangars, an office, and a small terminal area for arriving pilots can require several $1 million in build-out. Fuel infrastructure is its own major line item and a genuinely FAA-regulated undertaking. Underground or above-ground fuel storage tanks, dispensing equipment, and the environmental compliance systems required around them, leak detection, spill containment, commonly run several $100,000 to over $1 million depending on tank capacity and the number of fuel types offered, since most FBOs need to carry both FGAS for piston aircraft and jet fuel for turbine aircraft. FAA certification and compliance adds both direct cost and significant time. Depending on the specific services offered, an FBO may need various FAA certifications, and any construction on airport property typically requires review and approval processes through both the airport authority and the FAA, which can extend project timelines well beyond what a comparable non-aviation commercial build-out would take. It's not unusual for the approval and permitting process alone, before any construction begins, to run a year or more longer than a first-time owner budgeted for, which means carrying lease and holding costs for that extended period with no revenue yet coming in. Add insurance, initial staffing, ground support equipment, fuel trucks, tugs, de-icing equipment in colder climates, and total entry costs for a functional mid-size FBO commonly run $2 million to $10 million, depending on the scope of services and the scale of the airport it's operating at. A capital requirement that puts this business firmly in a different league than most of what we've covered on this channel, closer to the storage facility video than to the gym or workshop videos. The hidden costs in this business are substantial, and several of them are unique to operating on regulated, often publicly owned infrastructure. Liability insurance for an aviation business is its own specialized and expensive category. Aviation liability insurance, covering everything from fuel-related incidents to ground handling accidents to aircraft damage while under an FBO's care, commonly runs significantly higher than general commercial liability coverage for a business of comparable size, given the catastrophic potential severity of aviation-related incidents even when they're statistically rare. Regulatory compliance is an ongoing cost, not a one-time entry fee. Environmental compliance around fuel storage and handling requires periodic testing, reporting, and equipment inspection. Airport authorities typically impose their own operating standards and minimum service requirements on FBOs operating on their property, and failing to meet those standards can jeopardize the lease itself, not just result in a fine. Runway and infrastructure maintenance is a cost that, depending on the specific lease and airport structure, may fall partially or entirely on the FBO or other private operators rather than purely on the public airport authority, particularly for privately owned small fields. Runway resurfacing, drainage maintenance, and lighting system upkeep are expensive, infrequent, lumpy capital expenses that can catch an owner off guard if they weren't budgeted for from the start. And public use obligations are a structural cost specific to this industry that has no real analog elsewhere on this channel. Many airports, including privately owned ones, accept federal or state grant funding for infrastructure improvements, runway paving, lighting, navigation aids, and accepting that funding typically comes with binding obligations to keep the airport open to public use, often for decades, regardless of whether it remains commercially attractive for the owner to do so. An owner who took grant money to build a runway may find themselves legally obligated to keep operating a money-losing airport rather than closing it or repurposing the land, a constraint that's almost unique to this industry among everything we've covered. Let's make the fuel margin math concrete, because it's the actual engine of this business and it's easy to describe abstractly without appreciating the scale. Say an FBO buys aviation fuel at a wholesale cost of roughly $5 a gallon and sells it to arriving pilots at $7 to $8 a gallon, a margin of $2 to $3 a gallon. A single mid-size business jet refueling can take anywhere from 150 to several hundred gallons depending on the aircraft and how much fuel it needs for its next leg, meaning a single transient jet refueling can generate $300 to over $1,000 in fuel gross profit in the time it takes to fill the tanks. Compare that to a landing fee, which at many general aviation fields runs somewhere between $0 and a few $100s depending on aircraft weight, and is often waived entirely for aircraft that purchase fuel specifically to incentivize exactly that transaction. This is why FBOs actively want you to buy fuel rather than just land and taxi through. The landing fee, if it exists at all, is a rounding error next to the fuel margin on a single refueling. This also explains a pattern that confuses people outside the industry: why FBOs sometimes waive or discount landing and ramp fees so aggressively for aircraft that commit to fueling with them, and why some pilots specifically choose which airport to land at partly based on published fuel prices. The landing fee was never the product being protected. The fuel sale was. Now, the real profit mechanism, because this is where the fantasy and the reality diverge most sharply. Landing fees, the thing that probably drove the initial fantasy, are a genuinely minor part of the real economics at almost every small to mid-size airport. Landing fees at general aviation fields are often modest, sometimes waived entirely for based aircraft or for customers who purchase fuel, and at many small fields, landing fee revenue barely covers the administrative cost of collecting it. This isn't the business. Fuel sales are the actual core engine. FBOs typically mark up aviation fuel meaningfully over their wholesale cost, and given that refueling is often mandatory or at least highly convenient for arriving aircraft, fuel margin is where a substantial share of an FBO's gross profit actually comes from. This is structurally similar to the gas station model in some ways. The fuel margin, not a landing or parking fee, is the product. Hangar and tie-down rental is the second major pillar. Aircraft owners pay recurring monthly rent for covered hangar space or outdoor tie-down spots, and this recurring revenue behaves a lot like the storage facility model we covered earlier on this channel. A fixed asset generating predictable monthly income from tenants who, once settled in, rarely relocate their aircraft to a competing field for a modest rate difference, given the hassle and risk involved in actually moving an aircraft. Just like a storage unit tenant who quietly keeps paying long after the original urgency fades, a hangar tenant who settled into a routine of storing, maintaining, and flying from a particular field tends to stay put through gradual rent increases rather than go through the genuine hassle of relocating an aircraft to save a few $100s a month. Maintenance, flight training, and ground handling services round out the revenue picture, each carrying its own margin structure. Maintenance work functions similarly to the automotive workshops, parts, and labor dynamic we already covered. Flight training generates instructor hour revenue with its own scheduling constraints, and ground handling for transient aircraft, marshaling, cleaning, minor services, generates smaller but genuinely high margin fee revenue on top of the fuel sale that usually accompanies it. Structural risk and a case study. The core structural risk in this business is concentration around fuel volume and a small number of base tenants. An FBO's profitability is heavily dependent on maintaining sufficient fuel throughput to justify its fixed infrastructure costs, and losing a handful of large fuel customers, a corporate flight department, a charter operator, a flight school, to a competing FBO at the same field, or a nearby airport can meaningfully damage the economics, since the fixed costs of fuel infrastructure and staffing don't scale down proportionally with reduced volume. This dynamic has played out at various regional and municipal airports where a single dominant FBO lost significant market share after a competing FBO won a ground lease at the same field and undercut fuel pricing to win over base tenants, illustrating that even with the apparent mode of controlling airport-adjacent infrastructure, FBOs still compete directly with each other when more than one operates at the same field, and airport authorities frequently do allow multiple competing FBOs specifically to avoid the appearance of a monopoly on public infrastructure. Federal grant assurances that come with accepting airport improvement funding often explicitly require the airport authority to allow reasonable competitive access for aeronautical businesses, which means the monopoly instinct behind the original fantasy is often actively prohibited by the same regulatory structure that makes this industry so heavily governed in the first place. Bull versus bear. In the bull case, you've got an FBO at a well-located airport near a growing population center or a strong general aviation and corporate flight community, healthy fuel volume from a diversified base of tenants rather than dependence on one or two large accounts, strong hangar occupancy generating predictable recurring rental income, and a service reputation that keeps transient pilots choosing your field over a nearby alternative. That FBO can be a genuinely strong cash-flowing business, with fuel and hangar revenue together generating margins that, once past the capital-intensive build-out phase, can be meaningfully healthier than many of the other businesses we've covered on this channel. In the bear case, you're an FBO at a field with declining based aircraft counts. You've lost a major fuel customer to a newly established competing FBO on the same field. Your hangar occupancy has softened as tenants relocate to a nearby airport with lower fees, and you're carrying the fixed costs of fuel infrastructure and staffing against steadily shrinking volume, while any public use obligations tied to prior grant funding prevent you from simply closing or repurposing the property even if the numbers no longer work. That FBO can bleed cash for years, trapped between shrinking revenue and infrastructure obligations that can't easily be walked away from, a structural trap that's genuinely unusual among the businesses this channel covers, since most owners elsewhere at least retain the option to simply close the doors and sell the underlying real estate when the math stops working. The reframe. You didn't buy an airport, in the sense the fantasy implied. You bought into a fuel margin and real estate business that happens to sit next to a runway you almost certainly don't own outright, operating under a regulatory structure that constrains your decisions in ways almost no other business on this channel has to deal with. Your actual product isn't landing rights, it's fuel margin, hangar rent, and the trust of pilots who choose to base their aircraft and their business with you instead of the airport down the road. The people who make this business work aren't the ones drawn in by the fantasy of owning a runway. They're the ones who understood that the runway was never really the point, the fuel truck and the hangar lease were. Now you tell me, is it really possible to own an airport?